marathon, really. But the funny thing is that the developed nations have finished the race, while the developing are still in the running. And the fact of the matter is, some haven't even gotten started, ladies and gentlemen. What we say is that, in fact, the developed nations are the ones that are holding the ribbon that marks the finish line, and they're pulling it farther and farther away, making it harder for developing nations to catch up. And as the World Bank likes to put it, the gap never closes between the developed and developing nations. It only widens, like it does in their model. But for us today, side proposition gives you a way of closing this gap by giving developing nations the right to give priority to developing their own economies over protecting the environment if they need to, ladies and gentlemen. With this in mind, I'd first like to examine some of the major mistakes that were made by side opposition, then go into rebutting their third point on mortgaging the future, and further analyze today's debate in 3 areas of contention. 1. Is there a difference between developed and developing nations? 2. Can the economy, no thank you sir, be a priority over the environment for developing nations? And 3. Are there benefits to giving developing nations this right? To all 3 areas of contention, we proudly say yes. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's first go into the major mistakes made by side opposition in today's debate. Mistake number 1. They grossly mischaracterize our model throughout today's debate. They tell you we're forcing these developing nations into a dichotomy of developing their economy and progressing in terms of the environment. No thank you, sir. But this is not the case. We're not saying, no thank you, that if a developing nation can protect the environment, it should. We're saying that if it can, it should. But for those that cannot afford to do so right now, no thank you, they should not be punished for their incapability, ladies and gentlemen. Number 2, mistake number 2. Their case only deals with the need for us to protect the environment, and turns a blind eye to practicality. They've never responded to us on the consequences of what's going to happen if we force ill-prepared developing nations to develop green technology, no thank you sir, when they cannot, ladies and gentlemen. This was their second mistake. No thank you. So we asked the opposition to please wait. Wait to apply their model, a one-solution blanket solution, until developing nations are fully ready. Because under their model, we're all going to die in the long run. No thank you, sir. So with this, I'd like to go into direct rebuttals of their third point on mortgaging the future. So they talked about how we could save costs later. No thank you, sir. To this, we have 3 points of refutation. First of all, there's a reason for doing it later, because it's too expensive now, and we've given you the example of Nepal. Number 2, they can't collect enough capital right now to implement, and there's an incentive to protect industries. We gave you the example of India. And number 3, there's a disincentive to provide technology from developed nations to developing nations if their economies are going to be strained, as is seen in this economic recession right now. Yes, sir?
You mentioned closing gaps early in your speech. So is Team Korea's line that we should let all these developing countries get to the level of developed countries, that level of pollution?
No, sir. Absolutely not. Again, a gross mischaracterization on their part. We're not saying we're giving them a free pass to pollute until you graduate to becoming a developed nation and then pollute more. What we're saying is that we're going to sensitively take into consideration, I'm still answering a point, sir, the fact that they're developing. Give them some time to develop. And in this time period, give them permission to pollute, no thank you, to a certain extent. We're saying that after they develop themselves to make their economy strong enough, then they can join this ship of people saving the environment, but not now, because the ship will drown if we don't, ladies and gentlemen. Now, with this point, no thank you. We'd also like to go into our 3 areas of contention now. The first one is on whether there's a difference between developed and developing nations, and we say yes. The opposition, they group all of us all together in this gung-ho spirit of going green, but again, this ignores the problems of practicality. We tell you that, no, we don't deny that there are problems, environmental problems, that can spill over borders. But it's inevitable, ladies and gentlemen, that developing countries need to pollute to a certain extent. We're telling you that they need to pollute a little bit right now to save the environment a lot later. No, thank you, sir. The opposition has a misdirected focus in telling us that developed nations are transferring their burdens of their past mistakes. What we're saying is that we've never told you in our case that the developed world alone should clean up. This is a misrepresentation by the opposition. We're not saying that the developed nations are the sole actors, but what we're saying is that if you can't make the developed nations do it right now in the status quo, clean up the environment, how are you going to make these developing nations do it later? We've given you the example of China. What we told you was that, no thank you, before developing, it had a bad start. But by taking on more and more responsibility, it was able to develop not only its economy, but its environment. So their model is encompassed in ours by the issue of time, ladies and gentlemen. And if we move on to our second clash on whether or not the economy, no thank you sir, can be a priority over the environment for developing nations, we also say yes. The opposition comes up here and tells you that they should do both at once. We say that this argument is irrelevant, because if they can do both at once, we say go for it. But for those developing nations that cannot, for those countries where starvation, poverty, these are more precedent and pressing issues, then they have the right to prioritize. No thank you sir. They never responded to our first point on how for these people in these developing nations, the pressing problem is staying alive. It's survival, ladies and gentlemen. We give you the example of how in the status quo, there are countries that cannot afford green technology. And we gave you the example of the Three Gorges Dam. What we told you, thank you, was that we need to protect the present to preserve the future. Because what the Three Gorges Dam showed you was that if we rush to save the environment, it's going to lead to more colossal damages later. And it's going to increase costs when we're trying to clean up later, ladies and gentlemen. Now, onto their examples of Russia and Egypt. We tell you we can flip these arguments because these two countries couldn't afford renewable resources, and that's why they were polluting, ladies and gentlemen. In order to afford these sorts of technology, they need to develop. They talked to you about how the Copenhagen meeting somehow made it, in a moment sir, made it possible for developed nations to form partnerships with developing nations. But not a single dollar has been collected from these talks, and the deadline has long passed. Yes, sir.
Well, if the only argument of South Korea today is that developing countries can't pay for green technology, then what about the fact that there's billions of dollars lying around for any developing country that wants to have green technology?
Billions of dollars lying around where? If there had been so much money lying around, we ask why didn't developing nations find it before? And to go into our last clash on whether there are benefits to giving this right, we also say yes. The opposition tells us there are irreversible environmental damages, but we, on side proposition, have a long-term solution. By making these developing nations more capable, we're increasing the number of actors that can clean up the environment later. We say that clean technology can be developed after countries prosper economically. Yes, what we're saying is that we're going to make these countries financially independent and self-sustainable, which were never responded to on side opposition. In the opposition's case, we see that there's a developed world, and they say they're not going to stop polluting until the developing nation starts cleaning up. But this is exactly the mindset that stimulates the problem that we see on side proposition, ladies and gentlemen. The opposition tells you that developing nations should invest, but we tell you they can't because they don't have the capital. All of these suggestions, these solutions that they provided for you, have a simple rebuttal on side proposition. The developing nation can't afford this, both in terms of capital and in terms of how ready they are. They're not ready, so we say to give them the right to prioritize the investment. And for these reasons, we still proudly beg to propose. Thank you.